I am Jim Forbes. You got my contact information on the handout. I've written a white paper on this subject that goes into a lot more detail. You can find the white paper at electionreformerscoalition.org. And just click on Overturn Citizens United. And the reason I recommend the paper is it's got a lot of documentation. If you want to know how we know this stuff is true, the white paper will tell you. And there will also be some information here in the program. So the topic is money in politics. The question is, what could possibly go wrong with unlimited money in politics? In my opinion, it starts here. The Supreme Court concocted a certain kind of poison, but it was Congress that took the poison and got sick. And the poison is this unlimited money. So I'll be talking about how the poison works and why it's a problem. I just pulled a whole bunch of issues together: the economy, jobs, the environment, healthcare, student loans. Here's the thing about these issues, and we all have an issue that we care about most. But most of these issues have something to do with money and something to do with government regulations. And as long as you want something on this list changed, there will be somebody in Washington, D.C. that has more money than you that doesn't want it changed. So you've got a huge uphill battle. So whatever your favorite issue is, this one comes first. And the one that comes first is campaign finance reform. And when I talk about campaign finance reform, I know people glaze over, they get bored, they tune out, you know. So, you know, we got to wake up. We got to face the reality. There is some really harsh reality to face, and I'd like to cover that with you. So let's start with this one. This is the Princeton study, it's called. It came out last year, 2014, and it's by a couple of political science professors. One from Princeton, one from Northwestern University. And what they did is they took a team of researchers and they looked at almost 2,000 instances of policy decisions pending in front of Congress. And they went back and looked at all the available data. They broke down who was in favor of a certain thing and who was against it based on economic demographics. So, in other words, are the ultra wealthy for it or against it? Are the middle class for it or against it? Are the less advantaged classes for it or against it? Here's what they found. What they found is economic elites, the rich people, and organized groups representing business interests have substantial influence over U.S. government policy, while average citizens, you and me, and mass-based interest groups, that would be like MoveOn.org or the Sierra Club, have little or no independent interest or influence. So what that means is the economic elites dominate our government. And what that means is that we do not have a functioning democracy at this point in time. It's the rich people that are making all the rules. Now, you've all seen graphs like this. This represents what's happened to the middle 60%, people making less than the 80th percentile but more than the 20th percentile of the income. This is what's happened to our share of the gross domestic product over the last several decades. And I'm going to argue that it's because of the money. Because when only the wealthy make the laws, the rest of us are going to pay. I'll get specific here. In a 5-year period between 2007 and 2012, the most politically active corporations and groups spent a total of $5.8 billion on campaign contributions and on lobbying. And what'd they get? They got $4.4 trillion in return in the form of government contracts, in the form of favorable, tax loopholes, in the form of grants, things like that. So if you spend $5.8 billion and you get $4.4 trillion, you do the math on that, you're getting 760 to 1 rate of return. 760 to 1. I mean, I'm happy if I can get 5%. But the bottom line is it takes money to make money. And if you're in this pay-to-play system, you can make that kind of money. And the next time somebody tells you that Social Security is breaking the government's bank, look at this. During that same 5-year period, $4.3 trillion got paid out to all 50 million Social Security recipients. So $4.3 trillion for Social Security, which, by the way, we all paid into, right, versus $4.4 trillion for corporate welfare. So what is really breaking the bank here? Okay, and this is according to the Sunlight Foundation, by the way. It's documented. So, you know, we all have a sense that big money wins the elections. In 2014, the candidate with more money won 94.2% of the time, and in the Senate it was 81.8%. That number has been consistently around 90% for the last 2 or 3 decades. What it means is we got a pay-to-play system or crony capitalism. And crony capitalism is what you think is going on in the banana republics in South America, but our government is starting to resemble that more and more all the time. And pay-to-play or crony capitalism, obviously it corrupts the government, but it also corrupts capitalism. Because if only the wealthy people are making the laws, then they're going to make laws that favor them over their competitors. And that means we don't have a free market. So the capitalist system has corrupted itself. The game is rigged. Here's another change that's coming about, and that is in 2014, for the very first time, outside groups spent more money than political parties. In other words, a very wealthy few have more influence than the large, vast organizations that we've had you know, working in our political system over the years. So that's part of it. Here's another facet of the problem. Another way that big money affects government, and that's the revolving door. And you've heard about this. People come into Congress and they make contacts, they gain influence, they make connections, people owe them favors, and then they take that experience and all those contacts out and they go into the private sector and they make a lot of money. And in Washington, this is so common that they have a pet name for it. It's called monetizing your government service. So, in other words, taking the experience that we, the voters, gave these politicians, taking it out and making money for themselves and representing the big corporate interests against what's good for us. Here's why. Once a member of Congress leaves Congress to become a lobbyist, on average, they're going to get a 1,452% pay increase. They're going to make 14.5 times more money. So if you're making $200,000 as a senator, and that's about what they make, you can expect to get $2.9 million a year as a lobbyist. So what effect does that have? Well, politicians are doing it more and more. Right now, 42% of former House members and 50% of former senators are acting as lobbyists. And the reason that I can stand here and say with confidence that that's because of the wave of big money that the Supreme Court unleashed is because back before the big money, in 1970, 3%, only 3% of former senators and members of the House became lobbyists. So obviously what this raises is a massive temptation. If you're sitting in Congress and you can get a 1,452% pay hike by becoming a lobbyist, then you're going to, and this is a Washington phrase, you're going to lean to the green. Okay, and that's not talking about environmentalism, it's talking about money. And what it means is you're still in Congress, you're thinking about becoming a lobbyist because you want to make 14.5 times more money. It's going to influence the way you vote. You're going to vote in a way that makes the big money folks happy so that they will hire you later on. So the Supreme Court repealed a lot of laws. They repealed McCain-Feingold, but obviously they didn't repeal the laws of human nature, and people are going to be tempted by this kind of thing. So that's how insidious the money is. We got to make unlimited money illegal again. It used to be illegal. Supreme Court made it legal. And I'm not talking about getting all money out of politics. Obviously, there has to be a way for people to get the message out. But making unlimited money illegal again will help solve the lobbyist problem. Because lobbyists right now have too much power. They're basically power brokers instead of just policy advisors. And the reason I say that is because, you know, they are the eyes and ears of the big corporations, the big, you know, the billionaires in Washington, D.C. And they're the ones that recommend to their wealthy clients where to put the campaign cash. And so if you're sitting there in Congress, you've got to be worried, one, that the lobbyist is not going to recommend that you be given the money from the big corporation because you need the money to win. And two, you got to be worried that the lobbyist is going to recommend that they give the money to your opponent. And of course, 3, you're hoping that they give the money to you, so you're going to play the game. So we've got to reduce lobbyists' power and get the money out of their hands. And that's the way to do that, is get the money out of the campaign system, because that's where their power comes from. So, is this what our founders intended? Well, hell no. I mean, we know that's not true. And we know it's not true because they wrote it down, the Federalist Papers. James Madison was one of the most prolific writers of the Federalist Papers. And he wrote, "The House of Representatives ought to depend on the people alone, and not the rich more than the poor." In other words, people in Congress should not have divided loyalties. They should only be loyal to the voters in their district. They shouldn't be listening to outside influences. They shouldn't be listening to money, for sure. They should be just dependent on the people alone, and not the rich more than the poor. So, where did we go wrong here? What happened? Well, there was an organized effort to make this happen. And here's the man that started it all, I think. His name is Lewis Powell. And he became a member of the Supreme Court. Richard Nixon put him on the court. And before that, though, he was a lawyer for the tobacco industry and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And when he was a lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce, he wrote this memo. And I really urge you to Google this thing. Just Google Powell memo and read the Wikipedia entry, and you'll see all the things that his memo did. But it was intended to be a confidential memo. It got uncovered by an investigative reporter, so it's not confidential anymore. It's called An Attack on the American Free Enterprise System. And here's what he's recommending that the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and by the way, I am just talking about the big corporations here, right? I'm not talking about the mom and pop operations that maybe have a chain of gas stations or some grocery stores, something like that. He was advocating that the big corporations cooperate, that they put aside their differences and focus on the one thing that they all had in common, and that is the desire to make more money. And so he advocated a number of different ways to do it. Basically, it's just to pool corporate money to make more Americans more sympathetic to corporations. And there are a number of ways that that happened. But as a lawyer, this is the thing that really gripes me the most, as much as anything. He advocated for the establishment of an activist pro-corporate court system. Now, we've all heard, the news about judicial confirmations and how somebody's always saying, well, we want strict constructionists. We want people that are just going to read the law and follow the law and not be activists. Here's the hypocrisy, okay? When they're talking confidentially among themselves, they do want an activist Supreme Court, and here's how they got it. Among other things, the Powell memo inspired the creation of this Federalist Society. And the Federalist Society has a chapter on just about every law school campus. And what they do is they identify the promising young, talented lawyers who already have, pro-corporate sympathies. And they groom them to be judges. And they give them political connections, and they give them good jobs coming out of law school, and they get them ready to be appointed to judges. And here's what happened. Every single justice on the Supreme Court, and most of the federal judges, that were appointed by Republican presidents since 1986 were either members of or approved by the Federalist Society. So this is the group, and it's controlled by big corporate interests. This is the group that is screening judges. And of course, here are the 5. I put name tags on them. Here are the 5 who all were approved by the Federalist Society. They're the 5 that are consistently voting in favor of corporate interests and to strike down campaign finance laws. And what they've done, they fundamentally rewrote the Constitution to give wealthy people more power. And there are a couple of cases, there are actually probably 12 or 15 cases that really matter, but I'm just going to tell you about 2 of them. And this first one, Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976, this one is very much underreported. People don't hear about this case enough. Buckley versus Vallejo, Lewis Powell was on the Supreme Court by then, they ruled for the very first time that money has the same rights as free speech under the First Amendment. They also ruled that there can be no limit placed on how much someone spends running for office.
Now, this is a Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, yep, these are all Supreme Court decisions. Right. Citizens United, you've all heard of this one, 2010. Corporations and other groups have the same rights as people under the First Amendment. That means they can contribute unlimited money as long as they follow certain rules. And, you know, increasingly it's dark money. And by dark money, I mean, we can't trace it. We don't know where it came from. Did it come from China? Did somebody in China give billions of dollars to try and influence US policy to ship more jobs to China? We don't know. But we do know that the dark money is allowed, and the Supreme Court allowed it. So, I wanted to tell you how important the Buckley decision was. Well, starting on the left over there, that's 1976. It cost an average of $150,000 to get elected to the US House of Representatives in 1976. Well, that's within the reach of any of us if we're ambitious and we go out and hold bake sales and fundraising dinners and other events. You know, a person can raise $150,000. So Congress can be made up of people like us, right? But after the Buckley versus Valeo decision, because money's got the same rights as free speech and there can't be any limit, the amount went up and up and up until 2010. It cost an average of $1.2 million to get elected. And then after Citizens United, boom, it's through the roof. And that curve is not slowing down. It was $2.14 million on average to get elected to Congress last year, just last November. So how do the politicians raise that much money? This is where the problems show up. Well, either you're already wealthy and therefore you're out of touch because you don't understand the problems, the issues that most Americans go through. And right now, 50% of members of Congress are millionaires or better. So you can get that much money by having it yourself already, in which case you're out of touch, or you can spend so much time on the phone begging these wealthy interests for more money. And according to Reuters news service, the daily routine in Washington involves fundraising as much as legislating. It also means that lawmakers often spend more time listening to the concerns of the wealthy than anyone else. And so imagine what that fundraising call sounds like. You know, you're the candidate, and you're, yes, Mr. Rich Person, you know, could you donate to my campaign? Oh, yes, sir, I understand your concern about that provision of the tax code. Sure. Yes, sir, I understand. I'll see what I can do about that. You know, you're not going to get them to give money unless you cater to them like that. So that's what the routine in Washington is really like, and that's why that show House of Cards, I don't know if you've seen it, it drives me nuts because they never talk about this. In fact, the media never really talks about this. But the Supreme Court, and this is literally what they have said, the Supreme Court has ruled that people with more money can buy more access and influence. And here's a direct quote from John Roberts, Chief Justice. He says, "Influence or access to elected officials does not make those officials corrupt." So if a wealthy person has more influence, you know, in other words, they have better chance of persuading the Congress, you know, representative to vote a certain way, that's not going to make the officials corrupt, Roberts says. And he also says the appearance that wealthy people have more influence is not going to make the rest of us lose faith in democracy. And that is a direct quote. These two lines are direct quote. And so, you know, okay, here's Justice Roberts. You know, Justice Roberts, is it okay for money to buy influence? Yeah, buying influence with money is not bad for democracy. Seriously. Seriously. I mean, we know better than that. We know that when money is the equivalent of political power, then political power is not equal. And that goes against everything that this country was founded on. So, what we got to do is restore the First Amendment to the way it was before Buckley versus Valeo in 1976. And that requires an amendment to the Constitution. Because, and I'll tell you why. We need an amendment that separates unlimited money from our elections. And why an amendment? See, amending the Constitution makes people a little bit nervous. It's a big step. We've done it 27 times in the history of the country. We need an amendment because if Congress were to miraculously pass a law that corrected the money problem, the Supreme Court would just overturn it. They've overturned, you know, more than a dozen laws like that in the last few years. Secondly, legislation can be easily repealed. If Congress were to pass something, you know, fat chance, the next Congress could just repeal it. So the amendment is the only permanent fix. That's why we need the amendment. So how do we get our 28th Amendment? Well, the founders, knew that sometimes the Constitution would need to be amended. And in Article 5, the amendment can either start with Congress, 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to vote for the amendment, or it can start with the state legislatures. Because, see, the founders understood that sometimes Congress would be the problem that needed fixing. And so they gave us a way to go through the state legislatures to do it, and that's what I advocate for. Congress, I'm going to give you almost a direct quote from Mitch McConnell. You ask Congress to fix the money problem, Mitch McConnell said, people don't care about money in politics. He said that during last year's election. So forget Congress, they're not a help. We got to use the second way. This is the Article 5 convention method. We can skip Congress and go through the states, and these are the steps. First step, and this is where we are, 34 states have to call for a convention. 34 state legislatures. After that happens, we get to have a convention. And think about this. We get people from all 50 states getting together, talking about how to really solve this problem. It's a national conversation. I mean, I think it would be covered 24/7 on the news cycle. It's a national conversation that has not been taking place. Because it can't take place in Congress, and there's really no other place to have a good conversation. This is the place to have it, at this convention. Now, the convention stays under the control of the states, under the Constitution. That means that the state legislatures can control the agenda. The convention can only propose an amendment. It cannot amend the Constitution itself. And then, after they've proposed an amendment, 38 states have to ratify it before it becomes effective. So look at that another way. That means that any 13 states can block it. And if you put a finer point on that, what it means is one house of the legislature in any combination of 13 states can block it. Okay? So only something absolutely necessary and popular is going to get into the Constitution. And polls consistently show that more than 80%, sometimes 90% of people, when they're polled, they'll say, no, I want to overturn Citizens United. It's a ridiculous decision. It's ruining our government. So this one can get ratified. We need to have this convention to write our amendment to get back our republic. Because you've probably heard the story about Ben Franklin. He was leaving Independence Hall in Philadelphia after the Constitution was drafted, and a woman came up to him on the street and she said, Dr. Franklin, what have you brought us? Is it a monarchy? Because people were worried about monarchies. We just got done fighting a war against one. And he said, it's a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And he knew that a republic, a representative democracy that we're supposed to have, is a fragile thing, and it is vulnerable to takeover. And right now, we've had a takeover. So we've got to get our republic back, because right now the representative democracy is not alive. But there is a chance. There is this Article 5 convention approach, and we need to get those 34 states. So that's what I'm here to advocate for, and I'll tell you how in a second. Right now, Vermont, California, Illinois, and New Jersey have all passed this resolution calling for this Article 5 convention. And in the handout I gave you, I'll show you what one of those resolutions looks like. So we got 30 states to go. And then we can restore our democracy. We can have it back.